This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. Many of us can't wait for 2020 to be over, and the year only got worse after a tropical storm blew through Connecticut in early August, causing widespread damage and knocking out power to hundreds of thousands of homes and apartments. Now, we can't control Mother Nature, but in a state like Connecticut, where residents have among the highest electricity bills in the country, customers expect their power will be restored quickly. More than 700,000 Eversource customers lost power, and it took the utility company 1 week to fully restore all of them. Some customers were out for 9 days. Now, plenty of people are calling for reforms to prevent this from happening again. Coming up, Where We Live, we'll talk to the chair of the state's utility regulator, known as PURA, or the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. We'll also hear from an MIT researcher about how renewable energy and climate change will change the electric grid as we know it. Now, what changes do you want Connecticut policymakers to consider so utility companies are more responsive to customers? You can join us 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WMPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We invited Eversource to be on the show today, but the company declined. Joining us now by phone is a state senator who co-chairs the Connecticut General Assembly's Energy and Technology Committee. Senator Norm Needleman is also first selectman of the town of Essex, also a small business owner. Senator Needleman, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
So tell us, again, I mentioned that you lead the town of Essex. How hard hit was your town when that tropical storm blew through?
I think we were probably 90% out of power. There were a few homes off of one circuit that hadn't gone out. And I think that was typical for most of the towns around here. So the power outages were quite severe, and some of them were quite lengthy. The restoration began a few days later, and it was slow. It was just slow.
Many of us remember the storms in 2011 and 2012. You are a town leader. When you think back to those storms and the widespread outages, you compare it to this one. What changed in terms of the communication between Eversource and towns?
Well, I think Eversource attempted to do a bunch of things. They did a little bit of hardening of some aspects of the grid, and some of that worked, some of it didn't work. I think some of the main transmission lines were a little bit more secure. But when it came to communications, there's been a progressive path, in my opinion, to a much more top-down approach to communication. So the communication from the bottom up and working with the people in the towns was very weak. The system that they installed a few years ago to take outage reports crashed, and this is not the first time it crashed. I think since they put it in, it must have been 2016 or 2017, it's crashed 2 out of the 3 times when it was burdened because of a lot of outages. And the other thing they appear to have done is they consolidated in the name of efficiency down to 3 regional emergency operation centers in the state. So instead of being able to call from Essex over to Madison, which was the local place that they worked, everything was centralized out in New London, and I think every town in eastern Connecticut was out of New London. And the first time I had found out about it, I thought that they were tripping over themselves. There was no communication back and forth. I think that there's a value to being able to pick up the phone and talk to somebody. The world is changing. We can do less of that now, but when you're talking about life and death stuff, you really need to know that there's an opportunity to reach out to somebody. Every town has a liaison for storm management, for outage management, and typically you can have that person embedded in your EOC, your town EOC, Emergency Operations Center. And then there are sort of more regional liaisons that talk about the programs that the Eversource has, and they're more like a marketing arm. They're all wonderful people, but just to give you an example, our town liaison was home because they didn't want them to come into our EOCs, which makes perfect sense because of COVID. But he lost power. So he wasn't able to upload stuff. Anyway, I thought the communication is much worse than it was in 2011 and 12.
More salt in the wound when you talk about communication. Many residents, when they tried to call in those outages, they couldn't get through, but they were reminded, listening to an automated message, that these rate adjustments that led to high bills in July, while suspended, there's still an expectation that those will need to be paid at some point. That's really stressful when people think about how much their bills have gone up in recent years, Senator Needleman.
Ironic, isn't it? We've continually seen our bills go up. Some of it is explicable. Some of it, to me, is inexplicable. And as I said yesterday at the press conference we held, I'm not sure. I guess as a business person, I'd love to be in a business where I got rewarded no matter how well I did. And I think that the way cost recovery works in public utilities, partially regulated public utilities to some extent, they make money no matter what. And I don't really think that that's a good model. Plus, there's an enormous disconnect between the company at the senior management level and everyone else, their baseline workers, their customers. There's this sort of one thinks they're doing a great job, and the other one, the other groups just think that they're terrible. And minimally, it's a marketing thing. And my only comment is the reaction on the day Governor Lamont went to headquarters and Jim Judge did not come out with him as the CEO of the company, standing there with the governor saying, maybe we got the weather wrong. That can happen. We're sorry. We're going to work on it. We're going to pull out all the stops. We're going to do whatever we can. Instead, sends out somebody below him in the chain of command and gets very defensive. And their spokesperson keeps talking about, well, we're going to get the money back, and then goes on the investor call and talks about, well, we're going to get the money back. It all comes across as quite insensitive.
You're hearing State Senator Norm Needleman. He's also co-chair of the Energy and Technology Committee in the Connecticut General Assembly. There will be an informational hearing before this committee later this month where Eversource CEO Jim Judge is expected to appear and talk with you, Senator Needleman. When we think about the way the system is structured, it is complicated. We know that Eversource and United Illuminating, they have monopolies on distribution. They don't own the power plants that produce the power. And so when people see their bills and they wonder why these rate hikes are so steep, can you talk more, or maybe explain to our listeners where these additional costs are coming from?
Well, I don't want to just continually pile on Eversource. I believe that as a company, they could do better. I think that they have not done a great job in terms of how they manage their working, baseline working staff, and their storm response is hampered by their lack of people. But Connecticut does have mandates. We have, shut-off mandates. We have renewable energy mandates. There's some truth to the conversation that's going to go on in our hearing about what went into the most recent rate increase. Was it Millstone? Was it something else? How did we get to where we are? But the bottom line is we've evolved to the highest, one of the highest. Now, I think maybe I saw California and Massachusetts maybe a little bit higher, but we're certainly the top tier cost for energy distribution in the country. And I just think that we've gotten here because, in part, the management of the company runs the business as though it were a financial services company that happens to deliver energy as a sideline. And I think that's a mentality. It's not only them, it's a lot of the energy companies, and it's a lot of a big problem with corporate mentality today.
Mm. You and your colleagues, bipartisan effort, announced legislation called Take Back Our Grid Act. What do you hope this bill will accomplish, Senator Needleman? Can you walk us through some of the main points?
Sure. Well, I think we want to do what we can to, in the short run, empower PURA with some more tools to help hold the utilities accountable. I would like to see things like reimbursement for ratepayers, whether it be through penalties or reductions in their bills for the times that they were out. I've always found in business that an incentive to do better, a cash incentive to do better, sort of changes the equation. So, putting in there $100 a day per ratepayer for outages is a negotiating point. But some kind of incentive that says you're not going to be rewarded for not being prepared, for getting it wrong, and for taking too long. And again, enhancing PURA's, hand today with regard to both how they oversee the rate cases and storm response, I think is pretty important in the short run. We are all committed to trying to get something done if there's a special session soon. We don't want to tee up reforming the world of energy in a special session. We think that we want to point the way to a bigger agenda to look at more things, right up to and including has deregulation worked for the ratepayers of Connecticut. It was sold as a panacea, and I'm not 100% sure that it worked out the way the people who voted for it and the residents of the state thought it might work out. I know it wasn't universally liked at the time, and I was not an expert, nor am I still an expert in energy policy, but as a very large consumer of energy myself, because of my company, I think that we've ended up paying a lot more than we might have had this not happen. So I think that we need to be honest brokers. We need to look into what worked, what didn't work, almost like going back and looking at a budget as a zero-based budgeting. Let's start all over again, look at it. I think we want to do a fresh look at what worked, what didn't work, and maybe we should just revisit the whole thing of deregulation, decoupling energy generation and distribution. So, again, I have not spoken to one person who thinks that it worked out the way they anticipated it would.
When we think about storm restoration, Senator Needleman, we think about a company that, is publicly traded, is making a lot of money, but when it comes time for emergency response, not having enough on-the-ground people to do the job. So part of this bill requiring a minimum level of staffing, are you worried that could cause rates for customers to also rise when we're already paying high bills?
So, it's an interesting question. Last year, one of the main bills that I put forward when I first got into the legislature, because this has been an issue of mine for many, many years in dealing with Eversource as a municipal CEO, is that I talk to people who work for the company, and I know exactly how this system has failed all too intimately. It's not as though they don't have the work that has to get done. They've chosen to outsource more of the work than they insource. So, and I don't mean the mutual aid part in the event of a storm. Mutual aid is an unbelievably great program that all states and all regions utilize. I mean, the movement to more subcontractors and less company employees, less people that actually know the neighborhoods that they're working in, less people that that have some judgment about what they're looking at and can radio back and say, hey, maybe we should do this. We used to have 15 or 20 people in Essex that work for the electric company. I think the last fellow just retired. And if you ask me what the genesis of it was, why Eversource took this tack, they battled with the union for a long time, and I think that the battle came down to pensions, and there's a big ongoing argument between defined benefit and defined contribution nationally, and clearly the defined contribution world wins out, except in the C-suite. So there was a major attack on wanting to pay pensions to people. So for a long time, they just didn't hire people. They let the staff attrit down to very few. Now they have started hiring people, but the people that they hire take 5 years to become fully certified journeymen who could work on their own. I guess the word would be journey people now. But it's not a job that you can say, oh, I want to do that, get 3 months worth of training, and then go up in a bucket and a truck out on your own and restore power. You'll kill yourself or kill somebody else. So they have to, the charts out there show that they went from 750 to 5 something. But if you go into the 5 something and say how many are really line people and fully certified, able to work on their own line people, it's a lot less. And and I think if you go back even further than the 750, they had a lot more than that. And
you're talking about the crews, 750 crews.
People, not crews, individuals. And if I remember correctly from my hearing last year, UI had pretty much stayed stable with the number of crews. It goes up and down 20 or 30, but they ended up where they started out in that same time period. And I think that might speak to why they got power restored a couple of days later. I mean, I think with Eversource, there were a few other mistakes in this storm, but I wasn't in the EOC. I wasn't the incident commander. I have to give him the benefit of the doubt to some extent because you're under tremendous pressure as the incident commander in a major event. And, having been that in a smaller way, I want more facts before I jump to judgment on how he did. But I was on the the first selectman mayor call, and as well as the legislator call that they had, and the legislator call was quite milquetoast compared to that first selectman call. There were just too many trees down that they didn't have any crews to get to, and I'm not sure that they committed to tree crews quickly enough because this was, as I had worried about for a long time, a regional storm, albeit not 125 mile an hour regional storm, wind regional storm, but regional enough that when I went to a funeral on Thursday in New Jersey, there were trees down. My cousin down there lost his wife, and they had lost power for 8 hours. It was big. So if you don't commit to the crews right away, especially when they're contractors, when they don't work for you, they're going to go to the highest bidder and the first caller. So if you haven't committed, you're left out in the cold.
You're hearing State Senator Norm Needleman, co-chair of the Energy and Technology Committee in the Connecticut General Assembly. Again, we did reach out to Eversource to come on the show. They declined, but in a statement, part of the statement read, despite the damage being more severe than in Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Irene, this restoration was completed 33% faster. Again, that's from Eversource. We're going to continue to talk with Senator Needleman after the break. We're also going to hear from the chairwoman who leads PURA, the quasi-judicial agency that it regulates utilities in our state. And we want to hear from you too. Were you without power for days after this latest storm? What changes do you want policymakers and regulators to adopt to make utilities more responsive to you? You can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Were you without power for days after this latest tropical storm? Later this month, Eversource CEO Jim Judge will appear before Connecticut lawmakers, and the agency that oversees utilities, the State Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, will hold hearings to determine if electric companies Eversource and United Illuminating should be fined for its handling of storm outages, and whether the companies can charge customers to recoup what was spent on storm restoration. You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677. Peter's calling from Mansfield. Peter, you're on the show.
Hi. I would like to, first of all, congratulate Senator Needleman for all of his hard work on a very difficult committee, energy and technology, lots of complicated issues there. And I'd like to suggest that one of the things that Connecticut can do is to enable community choice aggregation, which is a policy that allows cities and towns to choose their own, create their own community power agency that provides default services and other modern energy products and services. And the reason that fits into this conversation is that the only reason that Eversource is a monopoly utility is because it makes sense to have the infrastructure of an electricity sector or electricity grid to be owned by one company. But there's no reason for Eversource to be the only provider or the default provider of electricity. Other companies can do that. There's no reason that it should be managing so much of the energy conservation funds in the state. Other entities can be doing that and doing other demand management services. Other entities can do that. They're called community power agencies, and you can find them in states like Massachusetts, New York, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, California, Virginia, Ohio, Illinois. And that's really something that should be considered for Connecticut. So Eversource can concentrate on taking care of the infrastructure, which is its primary job. And I'd just like to also congratulate or thank Marissa Gillett, the chair of PURA, for deciding to study community choice aggregation, also known as community power.
Well, thank you, Peter.
Lastly,
quickly, we want to get to Marissa. Go ahead.
Just lastly, there'll be a piece in the Connecticut Mirror, the online magazine for Connecticut, the Connecticut Mirror tomorrow, that explains this in more detail. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter, for making those points. I wanted to bring into the conversation Marissa Gillett, who is chairman of Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, or PURA. Marissa, welcome to our show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So Peter made some good points. Before we get to some of the points that he raised, let's talk more about the system we have. These regulated monopolies, Eversource and UI, they have exclusive access to sell customers electricity. They're also subject to government oversight. So talk about PURA's role. You're the new chairman of this agency, and how you can better oversee the utilities and the way they serve the customers in our state.
It's a great question. Thank you for that. PURA, there's an equivalent to PURA in every state in this country. They're usually called public service commissions. And we operate as a quasi-judicial agency, which means that parties have to come in and make their case before us. So it's not just the utilities that come in. There's also a consumer advocate. There's also the attorney general, some other state agencies. And we operate, myself and my fellow two commissioners, we're like judges. So our job is to oversee the proceedings and hear all the evidence, and then reach a decision based on the confines of the law, in which we're required to allow the utilities an opportunity to earn a recovery rate of return on the money that they invest on behalf of the ratepayers. So we do that for a couple of sectors: electricity, natural gas, water, and a little bit of telecom. But certainly our jurisdiction and our reach is much more limited today than it was 20 years ago. As you heard from Senator Needleman in the first part of the show, some of that's attributable to this phenomenon called deregulation that went across the country about 20 years ago. So certainly interested in having conversations about how PURA's jurisdiction and ability to hold parties accountable could be enhanced. Certainly a conversation I'm interested in having.
We heard both Senator Needleman, also Governor Lamont mention that utilities should be looked at in terms of performance. And so I'm wondering, as a PURA chairman, how you can go about changing the way, these companies are able to make money, and whether they even are allowed rate hikes in the future. Marissa?
Exactly. So what the governor spoke about, and what the co-chairs and ranking members of E&T committee have spoken about, is moving more towards performance-based regulation, which looks to hold the utilities accountable on a defined set of metrics. So the good news here is that PURA agrees, and we opened a proceeding last October called the Equitable Modern Grid that includes, as part of that, setting metrics for many of the baseline measures that you would need to do in order to hold the utilities accountable. The bad news is that proceeding is still underway. It has 11 separate tracks. Ironically, we did receive several proposals in response to some of those tracks July 31st. We're plugging away at it. It's very resource intensive, and we recognize the change needs to be made, and we're looking forward to working with the governor and our colleagues in the legislature on moving more towards that regime.
You've probably heard from many residents in our state, Marissa, frustrated with, again, how long it took for power to be restored. We're in a pandemic. People are on fixed incomes. They worry about their medications being able to be refrigerated and safe to use. They want to see the company reimbursed customers. Is this something that PURA can even get utilities like Eversource to do?
I've definitely heard from customers, both personally and through our customer service representatives. Thousands at this point have reached out, and I imagine many more will. Unfortunately, the current statutory construct limits PURA to levying civil penalties. We could also make adjustments to their rate of return in the future, which would impact customers' rates moving forward. But in terms of the calls for reimbursements on lost food or spoiled medication, PURA doesn't currently have the legal ability to order restitution. I understand that that's one of the proposals that Senator Needleman alluded to in the Take Back Our Grid Act, but currently PURA does not have that authority.
And in that statement from Eversource, again, they declined to come on the show. They said that customers should check their homeowners or renters insurance policies. Again, that was a statement from Eversource. Anna's calling in from Glastonbury. Anna, what was your experience during this outage?
My grandson, who is 5 years old, is on oxygen 24/7. We do have a small generator, and I called Eversource to find out if we could be put on the medical priority list for restoration. I spoke with a very nice customer service rep after a very, very long hold, and he assured me, yes, we would, but he couldn't guarantee exactly when we would be getting our electric restored. After a couple of days, I called back. I spoke with someone else, and I asked her about the medical priority list, and she said, all of our customers are priority. And I said, well, are we on? And she just kept repeating, all of our customers are a priority. I asked her, do you have a medical priority list? All of our customers are priority. Yes or no, do you have a medical priority list? All of our customers are priority. I would like to know, does Eversource have a medical priority list? I had asked them, please look at our record. See, our bill for the previous month was close to $900.
Oh, Anna, we're so sorry to hear that. Yep. I want to hear from Senator Needleman, who's going to be hearing from Eversource CEO Jim Judge later this month. This is a frustrating story that unfortunately can be duplicated many times over in our state, Senator. How do you, again, speak to Eversource about this, where, again, they don't want to be paying for the damages during this storm, but you see companies like Con Ed in New York that are voluntarily going to reimburse customers for some damages?
Well, first of all, I want to say to the caller, they do have a medical priority list. You should probably reach out through your town. In our case, the emergency management director has that list, and we as a municipality specifically will reach out to those people. But Eversource does have a list. It's not, medical priorities, people that are on oxygen, people that have other health needs. Not sure that they will actually necessarily prioritize return of service based on that. But if they can, they will. I'm surprised that was the answer you got, but that's just another indication of a relatively insensitive response to someone's plea for help. But again, I would say reach out to your town and let them know. And Eversource does have a list. And when we call them and say, do you have the medical priority list, from our point of view, to notify them in case we're opening up a shelter, or like in this case, we opened up a recharging station. We did grab-and-go meals for people. We had the Eversource list of priority health concerns. But yeah, it's first of all, it's not your mother's Con Ed. The way it was regulated, and it was a utility, and the salaries weren't where they are, and you bought the stock and got your 3.5% return every year. It was dependable. Everybody owned a few shares of the utility. This is when I say it's a financial services company that acts, that happens to be delivering electricity, I'm serious about that. And Eversource is not alone. Some companies do it better. In deference to them, we have an incredibly treed state. They know it. They should be better prepared for it. But people need to be aware that if you live in the woods and the wires are above ground, you're likely to lose power when there's a storm. So we put out notices to all of our residents to be prepared to be without services for 72 hours, and now maybe even longer because of the pandemic. But still, the company has demonstrated an even higher level of an insensitivity during this outage and this weather event than they have in the past. I was astounded at some of the things I was hearing.
I wanted to go back to Marissa Gillett again, chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. This won't be the last storm that hits our state, Marissa. So when you look into the future as the agency that regulates our utilities, is there a way that you can get utility companies to cut into their own profits to fund storm readiness and maintain more line crews instead of putting the burden on ratepayers? Connecticut residents have seen rate hikes since our last storms, and this is the result.
That's a great question. The current construct that we have to regulate within isn't tilted in that favor. Like I said earlier, the utilities to some degree are entitled to recover for the expenditures that they make. But what the check is, and it's an important check here, is that they have to come before PURA and make the case that the preparations and the restoration activities that they did were done prudently, and that the expenditures that they made have yielded used and useful results. There's a couple of terms of art in the energy law world that they have to come and they have to meet those burdens. So it's not automatic recovery. And like Senator Needleman said in the first part of the show, I too was troubled by hearing Eversource executives make repeated statements that implied that that was an automatic recovery, because that negates the role that I and my colleagues have in reviewing the expenditures and preparations that they made. Those still have to come before us. And if we judge based on the evidence that's put before us, that their expenditures and activities were not made prudently, then that is an action that we can take, is to deny recovery for those costs. And that's the investigation that we announced in a week or two ago, and will be underway in earnest this fall.
CT News Junkie reported that after the 2012 storms, regulators called for financial penalties to be imposed, and the company contested the finding, which is their right to do. That process was stretched out for another 2 years until the decision became final at the end of 2014. The former CLMP was penalized $4.4 million, but they were still allowed to increase rates. Again, Marissa, it's frustrating for residents when, civil penalties may be incurred, but then the fact that rate hikes could continue in the future. And that's what's frustrating for a lot of people.
I share that frustration. I honestly can't speak to what happened after the 2011 storm, since I'm just about a year into the role now. But I understand the frustrations, and I share them. And I think, what I've done with some of the lawyers that work at PURA over the past week or two is take a hard look at the process that was used in 2011 for the investigation, and to make sure that some of the legal hurdles that they faced when Eversource contested that finding, to make sure that we have that addressed from the outset this time around. So I completely understand and share the frustrations that the customers are articulating now, and for that reason, I will be eager to follow the Take Back Our Grid Act and see the ways in which our legislature and the governor work to empower PURA to hold the utilities accountable on a quicker time frame in the future.
You're hearing Marissa Gillett, chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, here on Where We Live. We're going to continue talking with her after the break, but I do want to thank State Senator Norm Needleman, who is co-chair of the Energy and Technology Committee of the Connecticut General Assembly, for joining us by phone. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it, and happy to chat anytime. Bye-bye.
You can join our conversation as well. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. With us on Zoom today, Marissa Gillett, chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, known as PURA. And also with us now is Richard Schmalensee, professor of management emeritus at MIT Sloan, also former director of the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. Dick, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Just had to unmute myself. Pleasure to be here.
So we know, I was just talking about Con Ed in New York. Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York City recently made comments threatening to municipalize Con Ed over poor performance. We've heard from residents and others who would like to see more municipal run utilities. When we look and compare that to privately owned companies like Eversource and United Illuminating, how do they compare in terms of performance and cost? What do we know?
Well, this has been an issue that arises periodically in the U.S. It was very hot in the 1920s. There were a lot of moves to municipalize or privatize. As I read the evidence, it's hard to see a lot of difference. I mean, you can punish a private company by reducing its profits. What do you do with the municipal bureaucracy that gets bloated? The evidence just doesn't show a lot of difference. In both cases, if you've got a single entity that really can't be removed effectively, you're not going to get the kind of performance you get from intense competition. But if you've only got one set of wires, you really can't have intense competition. So people are going to want to municipalize, I think, and maybe privatize. But I think the record shows that you don't get much one way or the other.
Marissa, Gillett, can you add to that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. Before moving to Connecticut to take this job, I worked in Maryland, and we had 4 investor-owned utilities like Eversource and 1 regulated electric co-op. And that's unusual. Not all co-ops or municipalities are regulated by their state commission. In fact, the overwhelming majority aren't. So I think the question of privatizing or municipalizing, I think the question becomes more, do you want the regulator in the picture or not? Because as Dick was alluding to, some of those things, some of the problems that you see emerging can happen in either case. And the whole idea of the regulated monopolies is that in exchange for not having any competition, they were supposed to have the trade-off of a strong, empowered regulator. So I would flip the question on its head and say, no matter what you do, you need to focus on making sure that the regulator has the necessary tools.
I agree with that. And I must say, I applaud the movement in Connecticut and elsewhere, for that matter, to performance-based regulation. This is not a simple thing to do, but I think it is important to explicitly define performance and reward good performance and punish bad performance where you can.
Can we talk about renewables and how this is going to require our grid to change pretty significantly, Dick?
Sure. I mean, across the country, and certainly in New England, there's a political movement toward decarbonization. It takes the form of requiring renewable energy. And renewable energy has the merit that it's clean. It doesn't produce greenhouse gases. Of course, nuclear power doesn't produce greenhouse gases, but that's another story. But wind and solar are intermittent. They aren't always available. Gas plants are always available. So it requires redesign of the system with the addition of storage, maybe, or building a lot of wind and solar so you mostly have enough. So it's a road down which much of the country is going. New England is going. We're looking at that at MIT. We have a study that I'm heavily involved in on the future of storage and renewable and grids of the future with a lot of wind and a lot of solar are going to need a lot of storage. None of this is free, so it's not going to lower costs. We find it's not going to raise them dramatically, given progress in all of the relevant technologies, but it will require some redesign. It has some potential reliability benefits if you have storage around the grid, and if you have generation, wind and solar around the grid, then it may be possible to sort of have microgrids where chunks of the system can function independently of the rest of the system. That's down the road, but it's a possibility. I don't think it's a panacea.
Marissa, how is PURA thinking about the need to build in these new technologies and also a grid that could eventually be carbon-free?
PURA is absolutely thinking about that. That's the Equitable Modern Grid proceeding that I mentioned earlier in the show. We have 11 different tracks. All of those are looking to come together to create the grid of the future. And I think we should make no mistake about it. Connecticut's infrastructure, just like a lot of New England's, is over a century old and in drastic need of modernizing. I don't even think modernizing covers it at this point. So, one of those tracks that is part of our Equitable Modern Grid proceeding is storage. looking at creating a market. And like Dick was talking about, there are reliability benefits that come with storage that can be viewed at the grid level, and they can also be viewed at the customer level. A lot of resilience comes from on-site storage. So when you're thinking about this in the context of storms, like the tropical storm that we just saw, any customer who has on-site generation and storage capabilities is a customer that doesn't have to be restored to the grid in a priority manner. So a lot of interesting context can be viewed when you're looking at these programs, not just in the context of needing to decarbonize, but also in the related context of additional accelerated storm activity that comes with climate change, for example.
Mm-hmm. Dick, we know that the cost of renewables has gone down, but it's still not as cheap as options like natural gas. So how do we reconcile that in a place like Connecticut, where we already have unaffordable electricity costs?
Well, it's not going to get cheaper. I mean, there are a whole set of reasons why Connecticut and Massachusetts, where I live, have very high electricity rates. Part of that is the sheer difficulty and cost of building anything in New England. I was talking to a solar developer who said, or a wind developer actually, said, we can't really build economical onshore wind in New England because you can't assemble a large enough parcel for it to make sense. So, which is one reason why everybody's going offshore. Mm-hmm. I think it's just not. We're going to make the transition, I think. It may be halting and it may take a while, but at some point there will be a national policy, I hope, that moves us in this direction. And it's going to be a bit of a bumpy road. We've done a lot of work on what that road looks like and what the end of it looks like. And technically, it's not that difficult. But in terms of designing regulation and designing policies to get there, right? Nationally, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the various independent system operators like ISO New England are wrestling with, how do you treat storage in a wholesale market? Is it like a generator? Is it like transmission? Is it something new? What are the rules? All that has to get sorted out as we move to these new technologies at scale. They will get sorted out, but there will be a lot of billable hours for lawyers as we go down that road.
Marissa, before we run out of time, when we think about federal policies towards renewables that could help this affordability question?
There are definitely federal policies. FERC, which Dick just alluded to, has not exactly been a partner, in my opinion, with the states over the past couple of years in particular. They have acted in many ways against state interests. And I think one of the things that Connecticut is most focused on is the transmission policies that FERC has enabled or not enabled, depending on your viewpoint. When we're talking about the rate increases Connecticut saw this summer, a large chunk of that was attributable to a pass-through cost from FERC. It's a transmission tariff that they regulate. And you need transmission if you're going to be in an area that has difficulties, as Dick was talking about, building grid scale generation, renewable generation in particular. So, there was just recently someone nominated to FERC to be one of the empty commissioner slots, Allison Clements, who is well regarded in the industry, has a lot of experience on that front. And
Marissa, we're unfortunately almost out of time. This is a complicated topic. We hope to have you back. Marissa Gillett, Chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. Also, I want to thank Richard Smallensee, Professor of Management Emeritus at MIT Sloan. And we'll invite Eversource again. Hopefully they can come on the show and explain those high bills that we continue to get. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.